Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Retire in BC podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a topic that's been in the news a lot lately, and it's continuing to make headlines even today: Trump's tariffs. We're going to cover what's happening, have a general discussion about tariffs, and chat about what, if anything, you should do about it.
Yeah, exactly. And as you pointed out, it's definitely in the news. In fact, as of the time of filming, 1 hour ago, Trump announced some new tariffs. Today, he's been calling it Liberation Day as he's been leading up to this announcement that he's made. Yeah, basically, we're just going to chat about how that's going to impact you and your investments and what tariffs really are and dive into the whole thing there.
Hey,
The
Ben,
latest.
I think he's actually hoping that we're going to make a movie out of it, sort of like they did with Independence Day.
Exactly.
Just call it
Liberation
Liberation
Day.
Day. Yeah, there it's.
Yeah. Don't know if I'll watch that movie. I mean, I probably should when it comes out, but yeah, there it is. The latest news as of today, and these things are so in flux with Trump. He says one thing, and then an hour later, 2 hours later, who knows if that's still what's going to be happening. But the latest news is that the US is going to be putting in a worldwide 10% tariff, presumably on all goods from all countries. They haven't really specified whether that's all goods or whether certain products might be exempt from that. So there's that base 10% tariff, and they're going to be putting in extra reciprocal tariffs based on what other countries have tariffs on against the US. So basically, that's a 50% tariff approximately. If a country has a 30% tariff against the US, they're going to do the base 10 plus another 15%. And so that country would face 25% tariffs on goods coming into the
That
US.
is actually what's happening to Cambodia. Cambodia is going up to 49% is what theirs is going to be. Yeah,
Yeah,
crazy.
which is crazy that effectively at that point you're just stopping free trade. They're going to find other trading partners and effectively outside of a few very small industries where they don't really have other options, effectively it's just a complete barrier to trade. Now on that list, I mean, a couple of them just off the bat here, like according to this graph today, China is going to be facing a 34%. I think that's an additional tariff rate on top of the 10%. Europe will have a 20% on top of the 10, so 30%. What's important to note that as of right now, Canada is not on that list. So as
Not
of
this
now,
minute.
not this minute. Again, things are in flux. Really, we're going to try to have a fast turnaround on this one, filming it April 2nd and hoping to have it out tomorrow. But you know, things change all the time on this topic.
So we're going to try to keep our political biases to a minimum. Keep in mind, Trump likes to flip-flop a lot. Things are in flux. We just don't know what's going to happen in the future, of course. But I think it's worthwhile explaining a bit what a tariff is and how they work technically and functionally. Like, I mean, in simplicity, a tariff is just a tax on imported goods. So picture for a minute, if I'm a manufacturer and I'm making widgets and I'm selling them down south, I'm selling them overseas, I'm selling them in Canada, and all of a sudden I'm facing a 25% tariff. So if I'm if my cost on those widgets is 50 cents and I'm selling them for $1, so I'm making 50 cents. Well, now all of a sudden, when I'm sending it down south, instead of selling it for $1, well, if I sell it for $1, I'm going to have to pay 25 cents for the 25% tariff to the government in the US. So I'm only getting, if I sell it for $1, I'm only getting 70, my phone's ringing. That should never happen in a podcast. I thought I had it turned off. Um,
Shame.
that's right. So if I'm selling it for $1 and but I'm having to send 25 cents to the US government, I'm only really getting 75 cents. So all of a sudden, if that's all that I do, I'm taking a 50% hit on my profits. They've gone from 50 cents down to 25 cents. So what am I going to do? I'm going to raise the price. Now, here's the crazy thing. For a 25% tariff, I got to raise that price not to a buck 25. I got to raise it to 133 because the tariff, the 25 cents to get myself down to the buck, net the buck, I've got to raise it by that amount to get there. So what's going to happen realistically is it's going to depend on um, how unique my widget is. If I'm selling something that's a commodity, um, that there's tons of other stuff up there. I may not have much pricing power. I may not be able to get away with raising my price. And so I'm just going to sell less of it, try to get a little bit more, but I'm not going to be able to recover that full cost. On the other hand, if I'm a fashion goods supplier and everybody wants my Armani suits, I don't care. I'm just going to raise the price, right? So definitely 110%, this is going to mean price increases to consumers in the US, but the amount of those price increases are going to depend on what gets imported. The other big negative is those of us manufacturing here in Canada, there's definitely going to be a hit to the bottom line. We're going to make a little bit less money. And again, depending on the type of product that we have, we're also probably going to sell a little bit less than we were before. But really, in a nutshell, that's all a tariff is. It's the US government, well, and we do it sometimes too, but in this particular case, it's the US government saying when you send goods down south, you have to pay this tax. And at the end of the day, that's what it's going to result in, higher prices and lower sales for us.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, and we do a little bit of tariffs ourselves, but it's been very low, and we'll take a look at that in a second up till now. But yeah, exactly. So a tariff at the end of the day, it's a tax on imported goods. So basically, whoever's importing the good, they remit payment, in this case, to the US border protection and customs and whatever. Ultimately, then that business, they don't really have too much of a choice. They're going to have to pass that cost on to US consumers, or as Arnold says, they're going to have to lower their bottom line quite a bit. They're only going to be willing or able to do that to a certain degree. Um, but yeah, basically, I think it might be helpful to look at an example like of a particular good, or like you did with a particular widget. But if we're thinking about, let's say, steel, because for a time there, Trump was talking about specific extra tariffs on aluminum and steel. As of the announcement today, we don't know if that's actually happening or not. But let's say some steel, we export some steel from Canada to the US, and they use it to make a car, which historically they've either sold that car in the US or they've sold it back to us in Canada. Now all of a sudden they they have to add an extra tax basically that they're paying. And so that car part, or that full completed car, whether they sell it in the US or they ship it and sell it back to Canada, the price is going to be going up,
Yeah, no,
right?
I don't actually know what they're going to do with those goods that are going back and forth over the country. Hopefully, they've got some sort of exemption there, but given how quickly Trump's making this move, I'm not sure that they've got those things in place.
Yeah, exactly, because it's going to be additive or even multiplicative, where when it's going across and the price goes up and then it comes back and then it goes across and again they're adding the
Yeah,
tariff on
exactly.
the already inflated price. Exactly, that's going to be a huge headache if there aren't any particular exemptions for things like that. So
So,
at the
so
end of the day, oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, so I was just going to say, so I mean, Trump's doing this because he says, we got fentanyl going in from Canada, dairy protections, illegal immigration. I mean, Ben, you know, how much fentanyl are you shipping down into the States?
Yeah, well, considering I don't even think I've traveled to the States in the past 3 years, 5 years, I don't even know. Uh, but got to be careful saying those things out loud. But no, exactly. It's he's come up with any number of justifications. He's just a talker, right? And he said, "Oh yeah, Canada, we have so much fentanyl coming in from Canada." That's complete bogus. It's I don't know the exact numbers, but it was like I think less than a pound had come across, or like it was 0.02% of all the fentanyl they estimated had come from Canada. So really that I don't think is a fair thing to say at all. He's talked about immigration. Well, I don't, frankly, I don't really see how those two are related, immigration and tariffs. He's just
No.
speaking for the sake of speaking. I think he has somewhat of a claim there when it comes to the dairy protection. We do have a fairly regulated and protected dairy industry. Even then, I think that's a little bit overblown. Really, at the end of the day, I think it's just an ego thing for Trump. He sees the words trade deficit and he thinks, uh-oh, deficit bad. The U.S. has to be the big, strong guy. And I think he's just throwing his weight around and throwing the U.S.'s weight around here. But like I said, going back to the dairy thing, we do protect our dairy industry to some degree. Basically, our government sets a minimum price for dairy products, so milk and cheese and those things. That's supposedly so that farmers don't go out of business due to price volatility. When the price of dairy, let's say it goes down significantly, you don't want farmers going out of business. Realistically, that's a pretty controversial thing to do. I'm not a huge fan of price controls and things like that, but those are in there. We also ban artificial growth hormones. The US doesn't. So there are some things to do with that. And then he's thrown around these tariff rates that we've been charging on imports for US dairy products. But realistically, even on that front, we've got basically a tariff rate quota that up to this amount there aren't tariffs, or they're the regular rate, and above that rate or above that quota, the tariff rates are quite a bit higher. Those are the numbers that Trump's been throwing around. Canada charges a 250% tariff rate on milk or whatever, but they haven't even been hitting their quotas to begin with. So there's been very, very little of that. Just to throw this in perspective, stepping away from dairy and looking at everything all together, up until the last data point we have is from 2017, all imports coming from the US, basically the ratio of duties or import, basically tariffs that we've been charging to the value of those imports has only been 0.2%. So basically you can crudely interpret that as in aggregate, we've been charging a 0.2% tariff rate on US goods up until that point.
Now, I think maybe it's worthwhile commenting. I actually personally think that there are certain circumstances where tariffs are reasonable and make sense. Like, I don't want to brush all tariffs specifically as bad, because I happen to believe that there are certain circumstances where, for example, as a country, we want to ensure that we maintain the ability to do something for national defense purposes. I mean, let's just maybe pick um, no, let's look at the pandemic as an example of this. I don't believe we should do this with drugs, but we saw very clearly during the pandemic a situation where we couldn't rely necessarily on other countries providing the vaccines for us that we thought we could. And we realized there was a bit of a hole there. So maybe we need to beef up our agreements with those nations. But if that had been an existential issue, something needed for national defense, in a case like that, it's actually worthwhile having the government subsidize an industry to make sure that it's strong enough for a wartime situation if it's deemed to be that kind of national defense need. And when that happens, if the government is subsidizing an industry, then it's reasonable for another government to throw a tariff on that to equalize the cost to because if we're subsidizing that, well, then that company or that industry has the ability to sell it for cheaper than really they could because we're subsidizing it. And in that case, it'd be reasonable for a country to throw a tariff onto something. Um, but yeah, and that's why in a free trade agreement, they actually looked at all those possible different things, and most things were zero tariffed. But I just want to I want to make sure we're not painting all tariffs as bad. There are certain cases to be made for them to be there, but not like this.
Yeah, well, and that exact thing, the national security, that actually is yet another one of Trump's justifications for why
Yes,
he's putting these
yeah,
in here
yeah.
is his claim was that relying on foreign steel is a national security risk, and that let him bypass Congress. Usually, U.S. Congress controls the trade policy, but if national security is at risk, the president can impose tariffs, and that's exactly one of those things. And similar, one of the justifications, even going back to dairy, was that you don't want to be 100% reliant on a foreign nation for all of the food sources coming into your country. It could hypothetically pose a risk. So that's a good point. And at the end of the day, like you said, tariffs, are they good? Are they bad? Really, they're just a different form of taxation. And to
Yeah.
Trump's credit, that's exactly what he campaigned on, was that he was going to lower income taxes in the US and they were going to get higher revenue, higher income from tariffs, even setting up a different institution to collect that
But he
money.
also said he was going to lower prices, and this is going to have exactly the opposite effect of that.
Yeah, yeah, well, exactly. And that's something I don't know if we'll hit on in a bit, but tariffs are pretty much by definition inflationary. You're
Yeah,
just raising the price of everything coming into the states, basically. That's going to be inflationary. I don't know if we'll get too much into the currency thing, but if our currency is not being inflated and the US are inflating away their money supply, that actually hurts the US dollar. So there are a few considerations there as well.
actually, the last forecast I saw, I was reading this morning, it was calling for a 2 cent bump up in the Canadian dollar just because of this. I believe that was over the course of the next 18 months. They were calling for that kind of a bump on the Canadian dollar. But for that reason, yeah, you're
hmm
absolutely right.
hmm hmm So I think it's worthwhile actually looking back and seeing we actually, in this case, have a history. We have a playbook we can look back at. Trump has been elected before. He's played with tariffs before. We can take a look at that at least to get some idea of what might be coming. Obviously, we can't know the future, but helpful to just sort of see. In the past, he has actually done almost the same thing. He did implement at one point a 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum and 15% on our steel. And then that was dropped actually fairly quickly. So there is precedent for him to put tariffs against Canada and then drop them quickly. Really, all we had to do was just not complain about him to the World Trade Organization. And that one was over pretty quickly. On the other hand, there's also precedent for him implementing tariffs against a country and then just leaving them there for a long time. He did that with China in the same in his same presidency there in 2018. That lasted a few years of effectively a trade war going on there. And in fact, it did impact financial markets. If you go back and you take a look at your investment statement for the year 2018, you probably had a negative year.
Yeah, I mean, some people are going to disagree with me on this, but I have less of a concern about the tariffs with China because we are so little politically aligned. I think that in that particular instance, again, almost as a national defense argument, supporting an economy that is effectively a dictatorship is a bit problematic. So I have less of a concern with that. But when the tariffs affect us, I would call us the US's best friend. And the EU, I would call that, the US's close friends. And when it affects, your friends, he's kind of stabbing us all in the back this way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's worth noting too. I mean, I mentioned 2018 was more or less a negative year and mostly due to those tariffs. But if you look at his whole first presidency, 2016 through 2020, I mean, Chinese markets were up, American markets were up, developed markets were up. It was positive all
Yeah,
around.
things jump back very quickly, and yeah, that's right.
Yeah, yeah. So really, this is well, hopefully these end up being a temporary short-term thing and we get back to normal. But the for me, the question is to what extent do these actually go in? Is it on all products? Is it on only certain industries? And how long does it stay for? If we have 10% tariffs in there for 6 months, well, I'm not overly concerned about that. If these start dragging on 2, 3 years and it's worse than that, that could be a problem. I mean, that's going to hurt the economy, both US and whoever is on the other side of that.
Well, and
So yeah, go ahead.
just talking about returns, frankly, I mean, the Dow at one point was down about 10%, but really today it's down about 6% off of its high. It's pretty much flat year to date. Now, I mean, we saw some stats after hours trading, so the stock market ends, but then there's some after hours stuff that happens, and there was some after hours negativity, depending on the market, as much as a couple of or 3%, I think, on the Nasdaq. So tomorrow we probably will see a bit of a further decline. But again, we're not talking massive, crazy declines. These are not things to be freaked out about. It's more sort of the mini panic kind of declines
Yeah.
that we will recover from probably fairly quickly, but we don't know for sure
Well,
how
yeah,
quickly.
and as you pointed out, like looking at the S&P 500, which is the biggest companies in the US, year to date, that's only down 3 or 4%, something like that. Other economies have mostly been up. So
Yeah.
so most balanced or most global portfolios, if you weren't overly in one country, most of those are flat, maybe a little bit negative, maybe a little bit positive year to date. So yes, there's been a lot of negative news, a lot of negative headlines about the biggest stock decline in one day since 2022 or what have you. But for the most part, like you said, not really something to panic about. Um, what is worth doing is just talking about quickly the response from other countries, what's going on, because that is going to impact things as well. Specifically, because we're a Canadian podcast, want to take a look at what Canada is doing in response. And ultimately, a lot of this has been speculation, or we've had to be saying, if Trump does this, then we'll do that, and those sort of things. So it's anything's possible. As of today, we don't know what our response is going to be, but there's been talk about reciprocal tariffs, of course, on the Canadian side, as well as, I mean, consumers have been boycotting the US a little bit. I saw recently air travel in the US is down 70% through to the end of September, which is massive. They depend a lot on us for their tourism. I know Ontario, Doug Ford was talking about potentially shutting down energy exports to the US. So there are a lot of things that we could hit back with. We don't know if we will or not at this stage, but a lot of those things are happening. Longer term, if this continues, we're going to be looking at building alternative trade relations, basically, and trying to trade with other countries. Silver lining as well would be we've been working hard to reduce trade barriers between provinces, which has been a positive
Ben,
development.
I'd actually argue that we have already started building alternative trade relations. Like this, and I was so um, happy that Mark Carney, the first thing he did was go over to Europe. He's a well-respected guy on the global stage. He he knows economics well, and the first thing he did was try to build those bridges with other nations, and And in fact, I'd even go so far as to argue that, or at least in my opinion, this is actually a silver lining. This is a positive side to this whole coin. I think that these trade relationships that we're building, this reduction of the interprovincial trade barriers, now that there's a real impetus to make them happen, those are actually going to have a long-term benefit for Canada. Whether it's building infrastructure to help uh, trade overseas, or whether it's doing things interprovincially, those are not going to be short-term phenomena. That's actually going to help us in the long run. So I'm actually seeing a bit of a positive to this. I mean, tariffs are not good. Don't get me wrong, but there's something happening here that is going to have a positive long-term effect. And what was it? I heard I was in some board meetings last week, and one phrase that kept on coming up over and over again was never waste a good crisis. So, we're not wasting it.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. Well, and the other side to this too, like, yes, there are positives on our end. I think there, as sort of we've talked about, there are actually quite a few negatives to the US for having these in place.
Agreed.
Frankly, a lot of Canadians have changed our behavior. People are buying Canadian, they're not traveling to the US. A lot of those spending habits are hard to break. If you've had a new favorite catch up in the grocery store that you've switched your buying habits to, even if the tariffs are dropped today and no longer exist going forward, I think he's actually done a lot of damage to basically US companies there that have been exporting
Yeah, yeah,
in the
for
past to
sure.
Canadians.
Yeah. Most people are going to go back to Heinz, but some people won't. And you're absolutely right. There's going to be some of that activity that persists. Yeah, I canceled the trip to the States. We were supposed to go there for a Wenatchee Marathon in April, and I mean, I had to eat the small cost of the registration fee, but I didn't have to eat the hotel cost. I just called them up and canceled, and that's lost revenue for them. Plus the lost revenue that we would have eaten at restaurants, we would have, over the course of a whole weekend, and that's, one small family. Multiply that by millions of people, and it is going to hurt them.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's a lot about tariffs. I did want to touch on the other side of all of this, perhaps the darker side, sort of what's going on here. Just as that tariffs are happening over here. At the same time, Trump has been making comments about Canada becoming the 51st state. Um, Frankly, I think he's been trying to. I think the tariffs are tied in. He's trying to weaken Canada's economy. He's flip-flopping on the tariffs. Um, he's not been consistent. He's trying to keep our business community on edge. I might actually have to revisit that view because as of the latest news, he's not specifically targeting Canada anymore. He's targeting the whole globe. He's, in my opinion, that's just a crazy strategic move to go against China and Mexico and Canada and the European Union all at once. It's just isolating the US. In my opinion, this is all going to go pretty poorly for them. But specifically with Canada, I think when he was targeting us with those comments and with specific targeted tariffs, he underestimated a little bit how mad Canadians would get, which led to this voluntary boycott of
I
US goods.
I think you're quite right about that, but I do want to touch on one thing actually that I have to respect, or maybe not respect Trump for, but admire Trump doing. He does have a bit of a habit of swinging for the long shot. And I mean, for us as Canadians, we don't like it, but you can appreciate how for the US, getting Canada or Panama or Greenland or whatever it is to join, getting somebody else to join the States would be a great thing for the States. And swinging for the fences like that is actually a positive thing. The way he's doing it, the way he's going about doing it isn't. It's nasty and it's mean, and we don't like it. But I do have to admire the fact that he's willing to go for that, to use a term from a book about big business, a big, hairy, audacious goal, a BHAG. And, um, you know, he would love as a legacy to add another state, any state. And so to throw out that into the universe um, is a smart idea. The way he's gone about doing it isn't so good, right? Instead of saying we would love this, trying to pressure people to do it or pressure countries to do it, that's not great. But I actually admire that wanting to go for the big thing, right? So, I'm not a Trump lover, but well, I'm not even a Trump hater, although I hate what he's doing right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I think well, I couldn't disagree more at the end of the day. I think number one, yes, execution has been lacking. He made people very angry. At the end of the day, I just don't think it was a good goal to begin with. In fact, I think he's undone decades of progress of friendship with the US. Suppose this Trump presidency had never happened and we were back a few years ago, we could have been talking about eventually doing some kind of North American Union, free trade, free movement, things like that. And frankly, I just think he's diminished relations between Canada and the US to such a degree that that's no longer going to be on the table for the probably for my lifetime.
I agree with you, but that's because of the way he's gone about it, not because of his desire to have another state, right? Had he gone about it saying, we would love to have you guys as another state, and well, if we can't have that, let's talk about this other union, that would be a different thing, right? It's the way that you go about it. And unfortunately, he's combative, not collaborative. And,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, so anyhow, yeah, it's unfortunate, but it has pulled us backwards on all sorts of different levels, and I think some of that's going to last for a long time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's kind of the story here is that there, even if we navigate through this okay, there might be some long-lasting repercussions that come from this. So what do we think Canadians should be doing? This, in my opinion, sort of is going to filter into two avenues. One, within a portfolio, should you be doing anything? And two, outside of a portfolio in your daily life, what should you be doing? I don't presume to tell you what you should or shouldn't do, depending on your level of activism.
Yeah,
I,
yes, you do. That's your job.
okay, yes, I tell people what to do with their money. Right now, I'm talking about the other side. Depending on your level of activism, I think that this boycott of US goods that people have been doing, it's effective. It is disrupting their economy. They are going to notice it.
Yeah, I agree.
Beyond that, well, we'll talk about the investments in a second. I think it might be worthwhile, depending on your industry, might be worthwhile actually building up your emergency fund a little bit. Um, Even before some of these tariff talks and things like that, the Canadian economy might or might not be doing so hot. Throw on some tariffs on top of that. We could be looking at job losses, disruptions, things like that. Just might be worthwhile having a bit of cash saved up and having that
So
sort
I'm
of
I'm a huge fan of having a large line of credit. Particularly now, I mean, this depends a little bit on everybody's unique situation, but here in Canada, so many people have this massive asset in the form of a house. And um, just because they've gone up so much in value, it represents an outsized portion of our net worth in many cases. And an easy way to have an emergency fund, a very big one, is to ensure that you have a significant line of credit attached to that. It's not something you want to go into, but if your job ends up being at risk and you do lose it and you're out of work for 6 months, I don't love the idea of holding 6 months in cash as an emergency fund. I love the idea of holding 1 or 2 months in cash, but having another 6 months or a year or even 2 years available as a line of credit should it be necessary. And I can't remember now if I talked about this in a past podcast, but Steve Polo's the guy that used to run the Bank of Canada. I think he ran it right after Mark Carney, I think. Um, he wrote a book called The Next Age of Uncertainty. And he had no idea what Trump was going to do. He wrote it after the pandemic, so he references that a little bit. But one of the things he talks about in that book is, in his opinion, we are entering a period, generally a positive period, but a period where there's a lot of uncertainty because even positive things, when they happen, don't affect everybody in a positive way. They're disruptive. And so, in his opinion, and I agree with him, we're in for a decade or more of greater uncertainty. In most cases, that's going to have positive impacts. Right now, we're facing some negative stuff, but all in all, we're seeing lots of things in the industries that are very positive, but they're not going to be positive for everybody. They're going to be disruptive. And if you're in that industry where it's negatively disruptive, better to have a big, solid emergency fund. So, absolutely, you build one up one way or the other. You may not have the ability to get that line of credit if you can't, build up the cash or keep some of make sure your TFSA is liquid. Even if it's invested in mutual funds, have some of it conservative.
Yeah, exactly. And well, that's exactly what I do is my emergency fund. It's kind of a multiple avenues. I have access to a line of credit if I need it. I have the tax-free savings account, even though that's invested. It's not really, so
Right.
a
You don't
couple
want to
things
pull it
like
out when
that.
it's down, but you could pull it
Yeah,
out
but you
anytime if
could
you
if you
had to.
really had to.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and yeah, with regards to that kind of uncertainty and certain places, certain people doing better, certain industries, and some not. I mean, that's kind of the whole concept of a K-shaped recovery, right? Where some people recover really quickly and then certain industries might fall off. And so just thinking about the uncertainty coming up, like I said, having an emergency fund, always a good idea, especially now you might want to be backing that up. Um, Other than that, now it sort of comes into within your portfolio. Should you be doing anything? Should you be changing anything? I'm going to start with the assumption that you had a globally diversified portfolio to begin with, that you weren't too heavy in any one industry. And in fact, that's actually something that I've been saying for years. People have asked me, why don't we just invest in Canada? Or why don't we just invest in the US? And I'm not going to claim that I knew exactly this would happen, but we know something will happen eventually. And having some proper diversification in place is a really good way to mitigate that and not have one country's underperformance throw your whole retirement plan off track. So, Arnold, should people change their portfolios amidst this Trump uncertainty?
Probably not. We've had some people come and say, I want to get rid of all my US exposure. And so full disclosure, we have actually built some portfolios that minimize US, still doesn't get rid of it, because it's really virtually impossible to have a diversified portfolio in some areas without some US exposure. But we have created a minimized US portfolio for those people who really want it. Um, I'm not doing it myself. I'm not pushing for it, but we have made it available to those who want it. The On a back tested basis, you give up a bit of return. And I think that will persist, in my opinion. So I'm not a big fan of ideologically moving out of the US for that reason. I don't see how that would have any kind of a real negative impact to the US. Those Canadian investors in US companies represent such a small portion of the ownership of those companies. I don't see that really having any serious impact to them. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Ben?
No, I mean, I totally agree. And I think I break this down into two parts there. One is an ideological, I want to move my stuff out of the US to not support them. And as you've said, that's not really an effective way to do it. I think your spending behavior is going to be 100 times
Far
more
more effective.
impactful
Yeah.
than your
Hands down.
investment
Yeah.
behavior.
Yeah.
The other one is, oh, I think the US might do really poorly because of this. Um, and that one I'm sympathetic to, but also I still think long term they're the best place to make money.
You got
They're
it.
you get tons of diversification benefits. They're a much deeper market than the Canadian market, and just you have to think about the market as the collective wisdom of every participant. You're probably not going to outsmart the market. Um, I just think that's an ineffective thing to do, and probably you don't want to. Now, again, that being said, we want to cater to our clients, and if you really, really want to get some money out of the US, we're happy to chat about that
Yeah. Just let
and
us
talk
know.
about that. So, um, those are most of the things I wanted to talk about. Arnold, did you have anything else to add here?
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, really, the key things that I just wanted to make sure people, yeah, were understood what tariffs were, knew that it was possible to minimize U.S. exposure, but we don't recommend it. Um, and also, understand that tariffs are likely to increase prices for those in the States, but also for us here in Canada, partly because we're going to have reciprocal tariffs, and partly because um, when prices rise, they do tend to rise everywhere, not just in any one given country. So expect higher prices. Won't be as bad here in Canada as in the U.S., I don't think, but expect that. But and build up that emergency fund just in case.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Other than that, yeah, I mean, just keep in mind that we might have some extra market volatility, but that's something that we always say, right? The very first thing we do is make sure that your portfolio is aligned with the amount of volatility that you can handle. If you think your risk tolerance has changed, always let us know and we'll make sure to adjust the portfolio as well. But yeah,
Actually, Ben, I actually thought of one other thing, and
okay.
this is something that I have been saying in my review meetings lately. And so you may not even agree with me on this. So you listen to what I have to say here, and
Uh-huh.
you give me some feedback here. But on average, typically, historically, we have seen a correction. So correction is defined in the stock market as a drop in the stock market of 10%. And we have historically seen a correction pretty much every year or two. They're very, very, very common. Half the time, clients don't even clue in that they've happened because they happen and then they recover so quickly. It happens in between statements. But very, very common. 10%, that's a correction. About once every 5 years, on average, we see a bear market. Now, bear market's defined as a 20% drop in the stock market. When that happens, it's usually more like 25 to 35. So correction, very frequent, 10%. Bear market, 20 plus percent once in a while, about every 5 years. With what's going on with Trump and the way that he acts and reacts, in my opinion, we're likely to see those 10% corrections more frequently. I think we're going to see them not every year or two, but once or twice a year. And probably because of that, because of the angst in the market, I've had more clients tell me they're anxious this time than ever before in history of like 30 years of doing business. um, the this being front and center, people are more anxious. Well, that tends to hold markets back some. And so I actually think it's my opinion that those market crashes, the bear markets, are actually going to be less likely over the next 5 to 10 years, or less frequent. So more smaller volatility, but less bigger volatility. That's my opinion. And so right now, I'm very much viewing these 10% corrections as great buying opportunities. And so I think it's actually, a great time to get out there and well, we'll see after today, after the reaction from today. But I think we're in the middle of what may be a very good buying opportunity, and more like this may come. So yeah, that's my take on it. And Ben and I did not talk about this in advance. Ben, what's your opinion?
Yeah, no, I'm on board with you there and sort of looking at them as buying opportunities when those dips happen. Realistically, tariffs are going to have some long-term impacts and things like that, but long term, I think we're still going to innovate and we're still going to have companies doing well there. Uh, Overall, like, yeah, no, I'm on board with that. I was going to say I'm a millennial, and so millennials have been conditioned to having these once in a lifetime events happen every 5 years. So it's because I mean, we had the dot-com crisis, we had the '08 crash, we've had COVID, we've had a housing bubble, we've had now Trump tariffs. And so we just roll with the punches.
But 08 was the only one of those that was more than a bear market. Like it
Yeah,
was
I'm
the
not just talking
and
markets, I'm
and
talking.
yeah, and the dot-com was for specifically high-tech companies. It was very bad, but for the broad market, not so bad. But yes, okay, I get you. You millennials, it's all a bunch of once in a lifetime things.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. It's just back to back. And really, I mean, that it's a joke, but it kind of speaks to the speed at which things are progressing. We
Right.
have so much technological advancement and things like that. So that's kind of the other side of things, is that I still think the US is, not that we want to get too in depth on the AI or the tech bubble, but I think they are the place to be for automation and things like that. Um, Frankly, the experts that I'm looking at, they've got the US projected with higher growth still than other countries. So
And
yeah,
largely because of the tech that you're referring to. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So I
No,
mean, political uncertainty, trade tensions, yeah, we're going to have some volatility potentially, but globally
they
speaking,
well, and those are providing opportunities. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think we're still going to get some
Yeah.
productivity gains and some things like that longer term. So, yeah, so that does it on my end. Thanks everyone for listening. Do remember to subscribe or like this on whatever platform you're watching. Leave us a review, send us a question, whatever you want to do, and we will catch you next episode.
Till next time.
Bye. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast may not necessarily reflect those of IPC Securities Corporation or IPC Investment Corporation. The information provided is for informational and entertainment purposes only and should not be construed as financial, legal, or tax advice. The hosts and creators of this podcast assume no liability for actions taken based on the content discussed.